The gentleman yields. At this time, the chair will recognize members for 5 minutes of questions. I'm going to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. First, Chairman Welch, to most people, the jagged and steep terrain of the lands that we're talking about placing into trust would seem of little value. Can you explain to the members of Congress that are here in this room this morning why, or this afternoon rather, why these specific lands are so important to the Barona Band?
When Capitan Grande was established in 1875, it was our home. So when we were forced to relocate, we relocated to Barona. It holds ancestral value to us. It's spiritual. It's jagged land, but it connects us to our home. Every day you can go down to Capitan Grande, and you'll see our members down there. They're either fishing or hunting, or just they'll spend Easter down there with their families throughout the year. It's a connection to home for us. I can go down there and I know where my paternal grandparents' homestead was. I know where my maternal grandmother lived, grew up. So it just the values to us is its home is sacred. And that's what we take into consideration in looking at this. And land management, like, Congressman Issa said, it's not a matter if we're going to have a wildfire, it's when. I mean, if you've seen the news today, there's a fire burning in California right now in the middle of the state. So we will manage that land. In fact, in the map, if you look at it, there's a fire break in there that was put in by our fire department, working with the U.S. Forest Service.
Can you talk a little bit, Congressman Issa mentioned the savings that would inure to the federal government in terms of if this land is transferred into trust. Can you talk just a quick minute about how would that savings take place, and what would it mean in terms of spending, federal spending with respect to this land once it's placed into trust?
We would maintain it. And also you're looking at wildfire. I mean, you can prepare for wildfire and stop its progress. When the winds start blowing in October and November, we had a cedar fire in 2003 where 90% of the Barona Reservation burned, and we lost 39 homes. So we'll build fire breaks, and it'll save the federal government money from having to do that themselves.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Carlson, thank you so much for your leadership on this terrific bill, H.R. 7954, which I'm proud to sponsor along with my colleague, Representative Ledger Fernandez, and so many others in this Congress. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that on your tribe and across Indian country when the buffalo was nearing extinction?
Yeah. So the long-term impacts, that would have, the U.S. plays a large role in helping the fishing tribes, restore salmon to their lands. And this bill here would, say that creating, protecting, and enhancing our buffalo, it's important for Indian country, and it plays a big role in supporting, what it also does with the fishing tribe. So what helping us to bring back buffalo. There's a lot of the funding that is needed for our buffalo programs. Like I talked earlier about the fencing and all of the infrastructure. Those tribes need those, to help to bring back, the significant animal to our lands. Not only healthy to us for healing, but healing our lands that they're on. And also the years that have gone by, I think of all of the trauma that has gone on with tribes over these issues that we have, like you hear about today. There's a healing that even other people of the buffalo are bringing to realize that there's a healing that needs to happen amongst all of us. So that's what's very important about, this for the tribes.
Thanks, Mr. Carlson. And can you talk a little bit about what the immediate positive impacts would be if H.R. 7954 is made law?
Okay. I had those. Well, of the long-term impacts, if this is, like I said, is the big thing is the funding, and I guess that's what makes the world around, especially, I guess, with tribes. So the long-term impact would just help, just as I mentioned before, of helping them tribes, who are real, especially in our southwest area. We talked about this morning that the land base to them some of them is small. So we would help them with, we're always looking for a larger land base for them, whether it be leasing or purchasing some other lands, and helping with that funding and helping with that infrastructure there. Drought is a big thing now in all over the country, and so those there would help, or long term to help those tribes with their infrastructure and returning those animals back.
Great. Well, thank you again, Mr. Carlson, for your leadership and your endurance and your persistence on this issue. It means a lot across Indian country, and I'm personally grateful to you for those efforts. My time has expired, and so at this time, I would like to recognize the ranking member, the representative from the state of New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, for 5 minutes. Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Ms. Nagel, you noted that many cases of women who experience violence never reach federal databases. And that's a huge problem because if we don't report the cases, how can we ever solve them? Can you describe a little bit in more detail how tribal facilitators appointed in the Badges Act would help make sure we have accurate data about victims and what it means to a family to be able to have somewhere to go to talk about their missing loved one?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this question. The Badges Act includes provisions that would require the Attorney General to nominate tribal facilitators. These would be, people who would be working with tribes and Native communities and federal law enforcement agencies to make sure that when a Native person is missing, that case gets entered into the database. It sounds really easy entering into a database, but it often doesn't happen. There are a lot of barriers to tribal law enforcement. Many tribes don't have access to the database, and gaining access requires significant funding. DOJ does have the TAP program, but it's not even enough funding for all the tribes in this country to access it. And so what this tribal facilitator will be able to do is to bridge that gap and to make sure that those cases do get entered into the national database. That database is critical because that's how other law enforcement agencies in other states and other jurisdictions find out that someone's missing. A lot of our relatives get trafficked and kidnapped across state lines. So that national and federal coordination, and even with other state partners, is very important.
And I think what you pointed out is really important, that some of the women or persons who go missing, they might still be alive, and we need to be able to find them, right? And thank you for sharing both that and the tragic stories of both Miss Stops Pretty Places and Miss Begay, of that there was nobody staffing the Office of Justice Service, and there were no resources at the FBI. Could you address a little bit this issue about staffing shortages and why we need to address that?
Yeah, the understaffing at BIA is a crisis right now. I will just say that, especially in Montana, where I represent several families of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And right now, I'm being told that the missing and murdered unit just doesn't have anyone who can talk to the families I represent because they have to go out and do the field work because there aren't enough agents to just answer calls for help. And so there's no time to deal with missing and murdered cases. In LMA's case, I think that there was a complete lack of federal coordination, and the FBI simply did not dedicate sufficient resources, time, or energy to searching for her. And I think it shows how the lives of our Native relatives are simply not prioritized when it comes to expenditure of resources at the FBI.
Well, the Badges Act hopes to address that and say that all Native women, Native people need to be given the same dignity as every other person. President Carlson, you mentioned the Pueblo Buffalo dances both in your written testimony and as you were talking. And one Pueblo member recently told me, and I'll quote, "The Pueblo Buffalo dances are deeply spiritual ceremonies that remind us of home. The thunder of the buffalo, a drumbeat, the heart, the spirit of the animals teach us that we are one and that we are powerful. When we look to where we are from, we know where we are going," close quote. And I think that speaks so powerfully to your testimony about how there is an economic, a financial, a spiritual, a cultural, a conservationist aspect to buffalo management. Can you talk about why this is actually part of tribal self-determination and food sovereignty?
Excuse me. Again, buffalo are a big part of our our lives, I guess, our economy, I guess, in our beginning. And the way I see it now, they're very spiritual, that's the way you're talking about. I've seen tribes, when we brought back buffalo to their lands, that were very emotional for the first time bringing them back. And so that, first and foremost, that's kind of a real big issue with us, is returning a big part of our culture that was taken away. But also there's some tribes, that's small tribes there, that just want them for that. There's other tribes that are bigger and have a lot of more population and land to take care of, that they would like to get into some economy to help them, even not only to sustain the animals there, but to help the tribe out economically. So in a lot of those ways, we're all different in those ways, but there's a significance of the importance to every tribe, and we're all different in our own way, so that each tribe has its own need of bringing this animal back to them.
Thank you. And I've run out of time, but Chairman Welch, I wanted to thank you for your written testimony and testimony that talked about your connection to the land being interrupted but not broken. And I also want to thank Ms. Carlos. Your sharing of your personal story highlights why this legislation is important, and thank you for sharing that with us. And with that, I yield back.
The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes of questions. I will now recognize myself. These questions are for the entire panel. Could any of you speak to the challenges faced by tribal members in rural and remote areas when it comes to filing for PRC after an emergency? And in your experience, is the IHS well equipped to process PRC claims in a timely manner? Are you aware of any scenarios that frequently lead to delays? And if significant delays exist, can this lead to a situation where tribal members are required to pay for care that would otherwise be covered by PRC?
Thank you. So yes, once that 72-hour delay, if that happens, especially when our members are coming from rural or remote areas, the coordination of even getting them home sometimes is delayed by figuring out the PRC deadlines. So if they are seen in an emergency facility, an ER, hospital, and they have to transfer back home or to a specialty care, coordinating that can be delayed by figuring out, is the PRC even going to cover this? Is this something that they have to pay for out of pocket? And if that's the case, trying to coordinate that can be very burdensome for families and extend their stay in hospitals until they've set up those aftercare services. So sometimes they can be held in the hospital just because they simply do not have the aftercare services provided already, and that leads to a further delay of services and a mounting increased hospital bill. Additionally, if you asked, is the IHS ready to address these in a timely manner, and that is no. We are currently seeing across the nation that PRC is delayed in being paid out to the billers, and what that means is sometimes that those bills go to creditors. And so the individual members are then now have creditors who are after them for these bills. And so what that can do is that can delay delay their credit score, but also increase the amount of money they have to pay out of pocket for other services. So the NIHB is supporting the HR 1418, which would have, if an individual pays that money out of their pocket, they would be able to be reimbursed for that versus just providers alone. And so that, again, we're trying to expand getting services to our members, making sure that they are reimbursed in a timely manner, and making sure that these medical events don't really derail the rest of their lives in other aspects. We know that when community members are receiving emergency care, if they don't have that PRC notified within a timely manner, they're left with that bill, and that can be detrimental to them and to their families. And so really it's a coordinated effort. When we have a family member that has an emergency, the first question we ask is, are they okay? The second question is, have you notified PRC? Which shouldn't be our first or second order of business. So this is something that is greatly needed. Thank you.
Would anybody else on the panel care to give their perspective? We will now take a brief recess, subject to the call of the chair.